December 18, 2023. Dr. Margaret Thornton had sworn she'd never step foot on Glacier Lake again. Not after what happened to Emma. That's exactly why she grabbed the ice pick when she saw the baby deer trapped beneath the surface. The ice was 3 feet thick. The deer had maybe minutes. Maggie started swinging, each strike echoing across the frozen wasteland like gunshots. What she found beneath that ice changed everything she believed about her daughter's death. The Minnesota State Police reopened a case they'd closed 23 years ago because of it, and for the first time since Emma drowned, when people talked about Margaret Thornton, they stopped calling her the grieving mother who lost her mind. The day Maggie broke through the ice, the day she discovered some rescues are actually resurrections. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ice pick slipped from Maggie's numb fingers as she stared into the dark water below. The baby deer floated motionless, its glassy eyes reflecting the weak December sun filtering through the surface. But it wasn't the deer that made her blood freeze in her veins. It was the metal glinting beneath it. A license plate. Minnesota plates the numbers barely visible through 23 years of lake sediment, KBH-4729. Emma's favorite hair ribbon, the yellow one with tiny daisies, still tied around the antenna like some grotesque party decoration. Maggie's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the jagged ice she'd just shattered, her knees screaming against the frozen surface. The car that had haunted her nightmares, the one the police insisted never existed, the one that made them question her sanity when she swore she'd seen it speeding away from the lake the night Emma disappeared, was real. "No, no, no," she whispered, her breath forming desperate clouds in the Arctic air. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, fingers too stiff with cold to dial. The deer's body bobbed against the submerged windshield, a cruel reminder that some rescues come too late. The phone rang once before dispatch picked up. 911, what's your emergency? This is Dr. Margaret Thornton. I need police at Glacier Lake immediately. Her voice cracked. I found a car. Under the ice. There might be. She couldn't finish. Couldn't say what she knew wasn't there anymore. Ma'am, are you injured? Are you safe? Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue. She'd spent 2 decades believing she was losing her mind, that grief had twisted her memories into lies. The entire town of Millbrook had watched her with those pitying eyes, whispering about poor Maggie Thornton who couldn't accept that accidents happen, that sometimes children just fall through thin ice. But there had been no thin ice that March night in 2000. The lake had been frozen solid for weeks. I'm sending units to your location, the dispatcher continued. Please move away from the ice, ma'am. It sounds unstable. Maggie ended the call and stared back into the black water. The deer's fur floated like seaweed around the car's hood ornament. Such a small thing to die for nothing, just like Emma. She thought about the morning she'd spotted the deer from her kitchen window, its desperate struggles beneath the ice, drawing her outside despite her decades-old promise never to touch these cursed waters again. The way it had looked up at her through that frozen prison, eyes wide with terror and hope. The same expression Emma must have worn. 23 years of believing she was broken. 23 years of therapy, medication, and well-meaning neighbors who crossed the street rather than face the crazy woman who couldn't let go. Her veterinary practice had crumbled when word spread that Dr. Thornton was seeing things that weren't there. Who wanted someone unstable treating their animals? The sound of sirens cut through the winter silence. 3 squad cars raced down the lake road, their red and blue lights painting the snow like blood and bruises. Behind them, an ambulance and what looked like the county coroner's van. Sheriff Tom Ridley climbed out of the lead car, his face grim as he approached the edge of the ice. He'd been a rookie back when Emma died, eager to close cases and move up the ladder. Now silver-haired and carrying the weight of decades in law enforcement, he looked like a man who'd seen too much. "Maggie," he called out, his voice careful. "I need you to step away from the hole. You see it, don't you?" She pointed at the submerged car. "Tell me you see it, Tom." He squinted into the dark water, and she watched his face change. The practiced calm of a veteran cop cracked, revealing something raw underneath. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "KBH minus 4,729, Maggie said. "Run the plates. I remember every letter, every number. I've been dreaming about them for 23 years. 2 more officers had joined them at the ice edge. One was already on his radio, calling for the dive team. The other was taking photos with a waterproof camera, the flash reflecting off the license plate like lightning. "Maggie," Sheriff Ridley said slowly, "I need you to know something. That case file, Emma's file, I've read it 100 times over the years. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence. There was never any mention of a car, because you didn't believe me." The words came out flat, emotionless. She was too tired for anger. "Nobody believed me. I'm believing you now." He gestured to his officers. "We're all believing you now." The baby deer's body had drifted closer to shore, and Maggie could see the matted fur along its neck where it had struggled against the ice. Such a small tragedy compared to what lay beneath it, yet somehow connected, as if the lake had finally decided to give up its secrets, starting with the smallest one first. The dive team would arrive soon, and with them, the answers she'd been drowning in for 23 years. The dive team arrived 40 minutes later, their black van cutting through the gray December afternoon like a hearse. Maggie watched from the shoreline where Sheriff Ridley had gently but firmly relocated her, wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket that smelled of industrial laundry detergent and other people's tragedies. Her farmhouse sat just visible through the bare birch trees, its yellow clapboard siding cheerful against the monochrome landscape. She'd painted it that color the summer after Emma died, desperate for something bright in a world that had gone permanently gray. Now it looked like a lighthouse guiding ships that would never come home. "Dr. Thornton?" A young officer approached, his notebook already damp from the lake's humid breath. "I'm Officer Martinez. I need to ask you a few questions while the divers suit up." Maggie nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the dark water where bubbles now rose from the dive team's descent. "I saw it speed away that night, March 15th, 2000, around 9:30. The words came automatically, practiced from years of repetition to therapists who'd exchanged meaningful glances over her head. "Can you describe the driver?" "Too dark. Headlights were off." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I told all this to Detective Morrison back then. He said I was in shock, that grief could make people see things that weren't there. Morrison had retired 5 years ago, moved to Arizona where the landscape held no memories of frozen lakes and missing children. Lucky bastard." The officer scribbled notes, his pen skipping on the damp paper. Behind him, Sheriff Ridley spoke in low, urgent tones with the dive team leader, their voices carrying across the water in fragments. 23 years submerged. Possible evidence. Handle with extreme care. Maggie closed her eyes and let herself remember Emma as she'd been that morning, 8 years old and gap-toothed, practicing figure skating moves on the kitchen linoleum while Maggie made breakfast. Emma had inherited her grandmother's grace and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that made her fearless on ice skates and equally fearless about staying out past dark. "Just until the streetlights come on, Mama," Emma had promised, already lacing up her skates by the back door. Jenny's mom said we could practice our jumps near the dock where Maggie now stood, watching strangers in wetsuits disturb her daughter's grave. She'd been in surgery that evening. Mrs. Patterson's collie had eaten a tennis ball when the call came. By the time she'd reached the lake, half the town was already there with flashlights and grim faces. The ice was solid, 4 inches thick according to the fire department. No cracks, no thin spots, no logical explanation for how an experienced skater could simply vanish. They found her 3 days later, she told Officer Martinez without being asked. Hypothermia, drowning, accidental death. The clinical terms felt like stones in her mouth. "And you never mentioned the car to anyone else? Family, friends?" Maggie almost laughed. "My husband left 6 months later. Said living with my delusions was destroying him. She'd never blamed David for running. Some people faced grief head-on, others couldn't survive in its presence. My sister in Minneapolis calls every Christmas and Easter. We don't talk about Emma." The lake had effectively isolated her, turning Glacier Lake Road into a dead end in more ways than one. The nearest neighbor was old Henrik Nordahl, half a mile through the woods, who still brought her vegetables from his garden and never asked questions she couldn't answer. The mailman, the grocery delivery driver, the occasional lost tourist, these comprised her human contact now. A shout from the water made everyone freeze. One of the divers had surfaced, his mask pushed up, gesturing toward shore with obvious agitation. Sheriff Ridley waded into the shallows despite his dress shoes, leaning down to hear what the diver was saying. When Ridley turned back toward them, his face had gone pale beneath his winter tan. "Maggie, I need to ask you something important." His voice carried a weight that made her stomach clench. "The car down there, it's not empty." The emergency blanket slipped from her shoulders as the world tilted sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're looking at a crime scene now. Multiple victims." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This isn't just about Emma anymore." The baby deer had washed up against the rocky shore, its small body finally still after its desperate struggle. Maggie stared at it and thought about signs, about the universe's cruel sense of timing. For 23 years she'd lived with the weight of being the only witness to something no one believed had happened. The town-crazy lady who saw cars that didn't exist, who couldn't accept that sometimes children just died for no reason at all. But the deer had led her here today, to this moment of terrible vindication, as if Emma herself had guided its steps onto the thin ice, knowing her mother would never ignore a creature in distress. The wind picked up across the lake, carrying the scent of snow and deeper cold. By tomorrow, the hole in the ice would begin to freeze over again, sealing away whatever secrets lay beneath, unless they worked fast. Sheriff Ridley's radio crackled to life, cutting through the frozen air like breaking glass. "Sheriff, we've got another situation. The Nordahl place. Henrik's not answering his door, and his neighbor called about seeing someone in his yard last night." Maggie's blood turned to ice water. Henrik Nordahl, her only real neighbor, the gentle old man who'd brought her tomatoes and never once questioned her sanity. The man who lived half a mile through the woods between her house and the main road. "Send someone over there," Ridley barked into the radio, but his eyes never left Maggie's face. "And I want a unit posted at Dr. Thornton's house until further notice." "Tom, what's going on?" Maggie's voice came out smaller than she intended. The divers were still working below, their movements urgent now, purposeful in a way that made her stomach clench. Before Ridley could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his face went ashen. "Martinez, take over here, now." He grabbed Maggie's arm, not ungently, and led her away from the other officers. 23 years ago, he said quietly, "when you reported seeing that car, do you remember who took your statement?" "Detective Morrison. You were there too, but—" The memory hit her like a physical blow. Carl Morrison. Oh God, Tom. Carl Morrison. What about Morrison? Maggie's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, scrolling through old messages with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. "He called me yesterday. Said he was coming back to Millbrook for the holidays, wanted to visit, to catch up about Emma's case." She found the message, showed Ridley the screen. "Look at the timestamp. 2 hours before I saw the deer trapped in the ice." Ridley's face went granite hard. What exactly did he say? That he'd been thinking about Emma lately. That maybe it was time to put old ghosts to rest. The words tasted like poison now. He said he had something to tell me about that night. Something he should have shared years ago. A shout from the lake interrupted them. The lead diver had surfaced again, holding something in his gloved hands. Even from the shore, Maggie could see it was small, delicate, personal. "Sheriff," the diver called, "you need to see this." They waded back into the shallows, Ridley supporting Maggie as her knees threatened to buckle. The diver held out a waterproof evidence bag containing what looked like a child's bracelet, silver with tiny charms, a ice skate, a snowflake, a small dog. "Emma's," Maggie whispered. "I gave it to her for her 8th birthday. She was wearing it that night." She looked up at Ridley with dawning horror. "It wasn't in the car when they found her body. I asked about it specifically. Morrison said it must have fallen off in the water, that we'd never find it." "How many bodies are down there?" Ridley asked the diver. 2 adults in the front seat, driver and passenger. Been there a long time." The diver's voice was carefully professional, but Maggie caught the tremor underneath. "There's something else, Sheriff. The car's positioned directly under where the ice cracked that night, like someone knew exactly where to put it." Maggie's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. The deer was beautiful, wasn't it? Just like Emma. "Some things are worth waiting for, Maggie. See you soon." She showed the message to Ridley, watched his face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something that looked like fear. "That's it," he said, grabbing his radio. "All units to Dr. Thornton's location. I want a perimeter around this entire lake. Nobody gets in or out without my say-so." He turned to Maggie. "You're coming to the station, now." "No." The word surprised them both with its firmness. "He's been watching me for 23 years, Tom, using my grief, my isolation, making me think I was crazy while he—" She gestured toward the submerged car. "While he got away with murder. Multiple murders. Which is exactly why you need protection. Which is exactly why I need to end this." Maggie pulled the emergency blanket tighter around her shoulders, but she wasn't shivering from cold anymore. The rage building in her chest was furnace-hot, purifying. "He killed my daughter. He destroyed my life. And now he's coming back to finish whatever sick game he started." Another text arrived. "The farmhouse looks so lonely in winter. You should have more visitors." Through the bare birch trees, Maggie could just see her yellow house, the house she'd painted bright and cheerful for a daughter who would never come home, the house where she'd lived in self-imposed exile, believing herself broken when she'd been the only witness to the truth. The baby deer's body had drifted closer to shore, and Maggie realized with crystal clarity that this had never been about rescue. It had been about revelation, and now the real hunt was about to begin. Sheriff Ridley's radio erupted in static before Deputy Chen's voice cut through. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. The Nordahl house. There's blood on the front porch, and the door's been forced. No sign of Henrik." Maggie's knees buckled. No, not Henrik. The old man's gentle face flashed through her mind, weathered hands offering her garden tomatoes, kind eyes that never held judgment. He'd been her only constant these past years, the one person who treated her like she was still human. "Get forensics over there now," Ridley commanded, but his voice sounded distant to Maggie, muffled by the roaring in her ears. This was her fault. Somehow, her discovery of the truth had painted a target on everyone she cared about. "Tom, I need to go home." The words came out steadier than she felt. "I need to think, to remember if there's anything else." "Absolutely not. You're coming to the station where we can protect you." "Protect me?" Maggie pulled away from his grip. "For 23 years you all told me I was crazy. Made me believe I was seeing things that weren't there. Now Henrik's missing because someone's cleaning house, and you want me to hide?" Officer Martinez approached cautiously, his face pale. "Sheriff, the dive team found something else. Personal effects scattered around the car. Looks like someone dumped evidence after the fact." He hesitated. "There's children's clothing down there, not just from one victim." The implication hit Maggie like a physical blow. Emma hadn't been the first, or the last. Her phone buzzed again. "Henrik sends his regards." "Such a chatty old man. Did you know he's been keeping a journal all these years? Very detailed observations about his neighbors." Maggie's hands shook as she showed the message to Ridley. "He's been watching Henrik, too. Watching all of us." She thought about all those evenings when she'd seen lights moving through the woods between properties, convincing herself it was just Henrik checking his fence lines. How many times had someone else been out there, using the old man's routine as cover? "Dr. Thornton," Martinez interrupted. "There's something else. We ran the license plate KBH-4729. Car was reported stolen March 14, 2000, the day before Emma disappeared. Reported by whom?" Martinez glanced at Ridley nervously. "Carl Morrison. It was his personal vehicle." The world tilted sideways. Maggie gripped the emergency blanket like a lifeline as 23 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled around her. Morrison hadn't just dismissed her testimony. He'd orchestrated the entire cover-up. The detective who'd held her hand at the hospital, who'd spoken at Emma's funeral about the tragic randomness of loss, who'd gently suggested therapy when she insisted on seeing what wasn't supposed to exist. "He was there that night," she whispered. "When I ran to the lake after finding Emma missing, He was already there. Said he'd heard the call on his scanner, but the memory sharpened with terrible clarity. His car wasn't running. Engine was cold. He said he'd been there for hours searching, but if that was true, the engine would still be warm, Ridley finished grimly. Another text. You should have accepted that accidents happen, Maggie. Would have saved everyone so much trouble. But you always were too observant for your own good. Just like your daughter. Rage flared so hot and sudden that Maggie's vision whited out. When it cleared, she was moving toward the parking area, ignoring Ridley's shouts behind her. She needed to get home, needed to dig through old papers and photographs. There had to be more evidence, more connections she'd missed, while everyone convinced her she was losing her mind. Maggie, stop! Ridley caught her arm. You're not thinking straight. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in decades. She yanked free. He killed my daughter and made me believe I was crazy. He's been playing with me all these years, probably laughing every time someone mentioned poor, delusional Dr. Thornton. How many other families has he destroyed? Her phone rang. Local number, but one she didn't recognize. Against every instinct, she answered. Hello, Maggie. Carl Morrison's voice was exactly as she remembered, warm, paternal, trustworthy, the voice that had comforted her in her darkest hour. I see you've been busy today. Where's Henrik? The words came out as a snarl. Safe, for now. Just like you could be, if you'd stop digging up the past. Morrison's tone remained conversational, almost fond. I tried to let this sleeping dog lie, Maggie. 23 years of peace. But you couldn't leave well enough alone. Ridley was frantically gesturing to his officers, trying to trace the call. Maggie stepped away from them, focusing only on the voice of her daughter's killer. Why? She asked. Why Emma? Wrong place, wrong time. Just like Henrik. Just like you if you keep pushing. The line went dead. Maggie stared at the silent phone, Morrison's words echoing in her mind like a death knell. Wrong place, wrong time. As if Emma's murder had been nothing more than an inconvenience, a scheduling conflict in his twisted agenda. Did you get a trace? She asked Ridley, though his grim expression already provided the answer. Burner phone. Dead signal. Ridley's jaw worked furiously. But we know he's close. Has to be, if he took Henrik. The implications crashed over Maggie in waves. Henrik's daily walks through the woods, his habit of checking on her from a distance, making sure she was safe. The old man had been watching over her all these years, and Morrison had been watching him. How long had the killer been planning this moment? How many years had he spent cataloging their routines, their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect opportunity to tie up loose ends? Sheriff! Deputy Chen's voice crackled through the radio again. We found Henrik's journal at his house. You need to hear this. Ridley grabbed the radio. Go ahead, Chen. Entry from last week. Saw the man again today. Watching Maggie's house from the old deer blind near Miller's Creek. Same man I've been seeing for months. Decided to follow him this time. License plate reads VCM 8912. Looks familiar but can't place him. Should I tell Maggie? Don't want to scare her, but something feels wrong. Maggie's blood turned to ice. Henrik knew. He knew someone was watching me, and he didn't say anything because he didn't want to frighten me. The guilt hit her like a physical blow. Another person trying to protect her. Another victim of her cursed involvement in this nightmare. There's more, Chen continued. Entry from 3 days ago. Recognized the watcher today. Carl Morrison, the old detective from Emma's case. Called the station to report it, but Morrison still has friends there. They said he was just visiting town, checking on old cases. Told me not to worry. But why would he be hiding in the woods? Why watch Maggie from a distance instead of just visiting? Going to confront him myself tomorrow. The radio fell silent. Maggie closed her eyes, seeing Henrik's kind face twisted with concern. The old man walking into Morrison's trap because he'd tried to do the right thing. Because he'd cared about her enough to put himself at risk. This is my fault, she whispered. If I hadn't been such a hermit, if I'd stayed connected to people instead of wallowing in self-pity. Stop. Ridley's voice was sharp. Morrison's been planning this for decades. None of this is on you. But Maggie knew better. Her isolation hadn't been just about grief. It had been about shame. Shame at being the broken woman who saw things that weren't there, who couldn't accept her daughter's death as a simple accident. She'd let them convince her she was unreliable, damaged, and in doing so, she'd become the perfect victim. Hidden away where no one would miss her when Morrison finally decided to finish what he'd started. Her phone buzzed with another text. "Henrik wants you to know he's sorry he didn't tell you about our little meetings. Sweet old man. Very protective of you. Almost fatherly, you might say." The cruelty of that last line made Maggie's stomach heave. Morrison knew exactly what buttons to push, understood that Henrik had become the closest thing she'd had to family in these long years of exile. The old man's gentle presence had been one of the few things keeping her tethered to humanity, and Morrison was savoring the chance to destroy that too. "He's not just cleaning up evidence," she said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. This was always the plan. Let me stew in isolation for decades. Let me become completely dependent on the few connections I had left, then take them away one by one until I had nothing left to lose. Ridley was coordinating search teams through his radio, his professional mask firmly in place, but Maggie could see the fear underneath. They were dealing with someone who'd spent 23 years perfecting his psychological torture, someone who understood exactly how to dismantle a person's entire world piece by piece. Another text arrived. "I left something for you at home, Maggie. A little reminder of what you've lost." Henrik was quite helpful in wrapping it up. The image that flashed through her mind, Henrik's gentle hands forced to participate in Morrison's sick games, nearly drove her to her knees. But beneath the horror and guilt, something else was building, something harder and colder than grief. Morrison had underestimated her. He thought 23 years of isolation had broken her completely, turned her into nothing more than a shell of trauma waiting to be discarded. But he'd forgotten what she'd been before Emma's death. A veterinarian who'd spent her career making life-and-death decisions, who'd never flinched from doing what was necessary to save the creatures in her care. Emma's killer wanted to play games with her grief, but Maggie was done being prey. "Take me home, Tom," she said quietly. "It's time to finish this." The drive to her house felt like traveling backward through time, each familiar landmark a marker in the carefully constructed lie that had become her life. Ridley kept his weapon visible, 2 squad cars flanking them in a convoy that would have felt protective if Maggie hadn't already accepted that Morrison was always 3 moves ahead. "Whatever he left inside," Ridley said as they pulled into her driveway, "we go in together. No heroics." But Maggie was barely listening. Her eyes were fixed on the yellow house that had been her prison and sanctuary, seeing it now with terrible clarity. The isolation she'd thought was her choice. How much of it had been Morrison's design? Every time she'd tried to reach out over the years, every friendship that had withered, every professional connection that had mysteriously grown cold, she'd attributed it to her reputation as the crazy woman who couldn't let go. But what if it had been more deliberate than that? The front door stood slightly ajar, and Ridley cursed under his breath. They approached with weapons drawn, Maggie staying close behind as they entered the house that no longer felt like home. The living room looked untouched except for a single item placed carefully on the coffee table, a snow globe she'd never seen before. Inside, a tiny deer stood frozen in perpetual winter, surrounded by swirling artificial snow. A note was tucked beneath it. Ridley read it first, his face going ashen. "Maggie, maybe you shouldn't—" She snatched the paper from his hands. Morrison's handwriting was still the same careful script she remembered from police reports. Emma always loved snow globes. Kept one in the car that night. Said it was magic, that it could make winter last forever. She was right, wasn't she? Your winter has lasted 23 years. Tom Ridley can tell you about the others. What others? Maggie turned to face Ridley, but the guilt written across his features already told her everything she needed to know. Tom, what others? Maggie, I was a rookie then. I didn't have all the information. What? Others. Ridley's shoulders sagged. There were 3 other cases over the previous 5 years. Children who disappeared during winter months, bodies found in lakes after spring thaw. Morrison was lead detective on all of them. The betrayal hit harder than Morrison's cruelty. 23 years of friendship, of Ridley being the one person who'd never quite dismissed her as delusional, and he'd known Emma wasn't the first victim and he'd never told her. "You let me think I was losing my mind," she whispered. "You watched me tear myself apart with guilt and grief, and you knew there was a pattern. The cases were ruled accidental drownings. There was never enough evidence to prove otherwise, and Morrison was a respected detective with 20 years of service. He was a serial killer with a badge, and you protected him. I tried to reopen the investigations 3 years ago, Ridley said desperately. But Morrison was retired by then, living in Florida. The department said there was no point in dredging up old tragedies without new evidence. Maggie stared at him, this man she'd trusted, seeing now how thoroughly she'd been gaslit by the entire system. Not just Morrison, but everyone who'd quietly agreed to let sleeping dogs lie rather than confront the possibility that they'd missed a monster in their midst. Her phone rang. Morrison again. "Hello, Maggie. Did you like my gift?" This time, she didn't hesitate. "Where is Henrik?" "Nearby. Close enough to hear you scream, if it comes to that." Morrison's voice carried a smugness that made her skin crawl. "Though I hope it won't. You've caused me enough inconvenience already." "Inconvenience?" The word came out as a laugh that had nothing to do with humor. "I destroyed your perfect crime, didn't I? 23 years of keeping your secret, and one stubborn deer ruins everything. You should have left well enough alone, like the parents of those other children. How many families did you destroy, Carl?" "Only the ones who got in my way." There was no remorse in his voice, only irritation. "Emma wasn't supposed to see me that night. She was supposed to be asleep in her bed while Mommy had her breakdown on the lake shore. But children never follow the script, do they? The casual admission hit her like a physical blow. You were there for me. This was never about Emma. You were hunting me. Clever girl. Too bad it took you 23 years to figure it out." The line went dead, but his words echoed in the sudden silence. Maggie looked at Ridley's stricken face and understood the final, horrible truth. Morrison hadn't killed Emma to silence a witness. He'd killed her daughter to break her. And until this moment, it had worked perfectly.